Good evening. It is good to see everyone here tonight. It's good to be together on a Friday night. I tell you what, it is unusual to have a meeting like this on a Friday night, but we are glad that you chose to be here. When we planned this meeting, I had no idea the condition that I was going to be in. The last few months have been shocking for us. Tomorrow night, I actually intend to tell the entire story of what has taken place, and so if you'll be here tomorrow night for that. But we have had a lot to get used to since this surgery. We have, in addition to the medical things, I'm trying to learn the new electronic devices. I've got a great van out there that's got a ramp that gets me in, and it's got a seat that spins around so that I can climb up in there and drive by myself. I've got hand controls to operate it, and those are wonderful things. You might have noticed that when I came up on the stage, I've got like an R2-D2 wheel that sticks up under the wheelchair, and it will wheel me up here, and it operates by a Bluetooth bracelet on my arm, and so when I want to go, I've got to make sure it's not on, I can just tap the chair twice, and it will go, and I will tap it twice to turn it off, and you control it with a series of taps. Sunday at South Haven, I was up in the pulpit preaching. I did not realize it was on. I hit the pulpit, and my wheel engaged and started and scared me to death. I stopped it really fast before I ran over into the Lord's Supper table. But we have had a lot to get used to. This next week, I'm going in for an MRI. I'm going to have another surgery. I had an MRI about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm very claustrophobic. I made the mistake while I was in there of opening my eyes. And when I did that, I said, "Get me out of here." And they took me out, and they said, "Would you like to go back in?" And I said, "No, I'm not going back in there." So some weeks later, I was in a meeting, and I was talking to Brother Jim Dearman. He was at the meeting, a friend of mine. And I was telling Jim about the experience, and Jim said, "Well, maybe they could give you something more powerful." And he said, "Maybe Valium." And I said, "It's going to have to be more powerful than that." And he said, "Well, maybe you could listen to some of your own sermons, and maybe that would..." Wow. With friends like that, right? All right. About a year ago, we had the lectureship at South Haven. The last night of our meeting, Brother Robert Taylor spoke and closed out the meeting. Right as the meeting was ending, I got a phone call from Sherry, and she said, "You need to get over to the Wesley Meadows retirement home." That's where her dad was staying. She said, "Daddy is not doing well. He's close to the end." And so I jumped in my truck and I took off over there. When I got there, Sherry and her sister and the hospice nurse were sitting in the room, and her dad was just breathing erratically. He was, and Sherry said he'd been like that for hours. The hospice nurse said to me, He's hanging on. He doesn't want to let go. He needs somebody to tell him it's okay, that he can let go." And so I walked over to him and I put my hand on his chest and I said, "Frank, it's okay." I think he did not want to let go. He did not want to die and leave his daughters there alone. And he wanted me or Brandy's husband to be there. And so I put my hand on his chest and I said, "It's okay. You can go. Go be with Jane. Go be with the Lord." And after hours of doing that, it was maybe another 60 seconds. And he breathed his last breath and he settled down and he passed from this life. We wonder what happens at moments like that. Most of us have experienced a moment like that or will experience a moment like that at some point in our lifetimes. We're going to talk tonight about the subject, what happens when we die. In fact, this sermon originally I entitled it, "The Soul from Birth to Eternity." And when I wrote that, I went back and I changed it. In fact, we're going to use a chart. I want you to watch this as we trace this chart tonight. This chart is going to represent 3 different phases. At the beginning, we're going to have the earth. This, of course, is the point that all of us are currently at. When I entitled this sermon, "The Soul from Birth to Eternity," think about the words of that, the soul from birth to eternity. When I thought about it, I thought, that's not the proper name, is it? I want you to notice what I did. I went back and I added this. You see that arrow coming from heaven? And I changed the name of this sermon because I realized that the soul doesn't begin at the point of birth. The soul begins at the point of conception. Listen to this. This is very important. This is a passage that oftentimes we use it at funerals, and we use it to describe death, but it tells us something very important about the beginning of life. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7 says, "Then shall the dust return to the earth as it were, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it." You see, we talk about death, but it tells us that God is the one who gives the spirit. That's the reason I went back and I added this. The spirit, the soul, comes from heaven. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 9 calls God the Father of spirits. And so what that means is at the point of conception, when that egg meets that sperm and a new life is created, you've got that teeny tiny baby, and Mama and Daddy give that child his physical characteristics, but they don't give him his soul. God is the one who gives the soul. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, God said, "Let us," that is the Godhead, "let us make man after our own image, after our likeness." What does that mean? Have you ever thought about that? What does it mean that we are made in the image of God? Friends, I think primarily it has reference to the fact that we have a soul. We are beings now who will last forever and ever and ever. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to trace the journey of the soul from the moment of conception until eternity. And so from the time that God places that soul in that teeny tiny little human being, that soul will continue to dwell in this body as long as this body lives. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1 says this, "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent," now stop right there. That's interesting. He says this earthly house, he's talking about this body, and he calls it a tent. Hold that thought for a minute. He says, we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now notice some things there. He calls this body a tent. Why would he call this body a tent? You know, if you go out camping for the weekend, you don't take bricks and mortar, do you? You don't do that. You build a tent. Why do you build a tent? You say, because I'm not going to be there very long. Why does he call this body a tent? Because the soul is not going to be in this body very long. He says, our earthly body, this tent, is going to be destroyed, and then we get, he says, a building from God, eternal in the heavens. Hold that thought for a minute. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 54 calls this body physical. It calls it mortal. It calls it corruptible. And so what that means is, for 70 years, 80 years, however long I live, my soul is going to dwell in this tent. Now, during that time, I'm going to worship God, but I'm going to do it with my soul, right? Tonight, we sung, we engaged our physical body, we moved our lips, we moved our vocal cords, but we really worship God with our soul, didn't we? John 4:24, God is a spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so we worship God with our spirit, or we don't. During that time, 70 years, 80 years, we love God, but we do it with our spirit, don't we? Isn't that what Jesus said in Luke chapter 10, verse 27? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength, all of your mind. And so during that 70 or 80 years, you're going to love God with your soul, your spirit, or you don't. Everybody makes that choice. Now, all the while, for that 70 or 80 or 90 years, for some people, the body is wearing out. Listen what Solomon says. Solomon very eloquently describes the wearing out of the body in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. He says, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. He says, before the difficult days come. That is, remember God when you're a young person. He said, because when you get aged, it gets hard. It gets difficult in many ways. He says, and the years draw nigh that you say, I have no pleasure in them. Oftentimes, the body wears out. A person gets very old. They don't enjoy the pleasures that they did as a young person. He says, when the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are not darkened. You know what that's talking about? You get old and your eyesight begins to fail. He said, the clouds do not return after the rain, in the days when the keepers of the house begin to tremble. What's he talking about? He's talking about your hands. You get old, the keepers of the house, he says, begin to tremble. He says, and the strong men bow themselves because they are weak. He's describing the legs. You get old, and the strong men, that's your legs, they bow. That is, they get weak and they fall down. The grinders cease because they are few. You begin to lose your teeth. They that look through the windows grow dim. The doors are shut in the street. The sound of grinding is low. One rises up at the sound of a bird. You don't sleep like you did as a young person. Every little thing disturbs you. The daughters of music are brought low. You begin to lose your hearing. He says they are afraid of heights. Why would you be afraid of heights when you get older? Well, if the strong men are bowing themselves and your legs are shaky, you're not going to want to be in high places. He says there are terrors in the way. Then he says the almond tree blossoms. What is that talking about? If you've ever seen an almond tree when the leaves turn white or they turn gray and it's just blossoming, he said it's like the hair of the head. In fact, I see some almond trees out here this evening, and he said it's like the leaves on the tree is like that almond. Now, for some of us, the leaves just fall out, but it's the same thing that he's describing there. He says the grasshopper is a burden. Something that used to be small is now a burden. But then listen, man goes to his eternal home. Mourners go about the street. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel is broken at the well. He's describing in eloquent terms the fact that you die. Now listen. Then shall the dust return to the earth, as it were, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it. And so what happens is, at the point of conception, God puts a soul in that body. It's a tent. For the next 60, 70, 80, 90 years, that soul stays in this body. All the while, the body is wearing out. It gets to where it can't see, it can't hear, it's failing, it's going to die. It returns to the earth, and then the spirit returns to God who gave it. That is death. I want you to look at the next click on the chart here. Do you see this little bridge that I created on the chart? This represents death. Now you see there are two different pathways. One is narrow, one is wide. It is because Matthew 7:13 says, straight is the gate, narrow is the way that leadeth unto life, and few there be that enter in thereat. The way that is straight, that leads to heaven, eternal life, few people, he says, go in. Now, the second one is larger. That's because Matthew 7:14 says, wide is the gate, broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many, in fact, most, in reality, most, there will be who will enter in thereat. Hebrews 9:27 says, it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment. You know, sometimes I hear people, and they will say, I died, and I went to heaven, and they come back and they write a book about it. You ever heard people say that sort of thing? You know, I don't believe people when they say that, because the Bible says, since the days of miracles, you don't come back. It is appointed unto men once to die, and after this, the judgment. So what happens when we die? Now, somebody might say, well, Don, we're going to get a new body. I know that's what happens. For 75 years, my soul's been dwelling in this body, and then I die. Where is my soul going to go? The psalmist said in Psalm 90 and verse 10, the days of our years are 70 years. If by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off. Now listen to this part, I like this. And we fly away. He says, you live 70 years. If you're strong, you might live 80 years, but then you die, and we fly away. The body dies, but the person that is me fly. I've oftentimes said at funerals that right in front of the pulpit, we will have the body laid out in a casket, and I will oftentimes say, Brother so-and-so is not here with us today, because he's flown away. He's gone to be with the Lord. What we have here with us today is the tent. You see, he's no longer in the tent. Genesis chapter 35 and verse 18 describes the death of Rachel. And it uses very interesting language. She died in childbirth when she was having her son Benjamin. And the Bible says this, and it came to pass as her soul was in departing. Isn't that interesting language? As her soul was in departing. That's the description of death. That's how the Bible defines death, is when the soul leaves the body. That's why James 2:26 says, the body without the spirit is dead. The biblical definition of death is when the spirit leaves the body. So what happens to my spirit when it leaves the body? Somebody says, well, Don, when the spirit leaves the body, one day it's going to get a new body. That's true. On the day of judgment, it's going to get a new body. On the day of resurrection, it's going to get a new body. But what about in the meantime? What if the day of judgment doesn't come for another 2,000 years and I die tonight? What's going to happen to my spirit? Listen to this. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1 says this, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, eternal in the heavens, not made with hands. That is, right now, I have a tent. It's temporary. One day, I'm going to get a resurrected body. He calls that a building. It's never going to be destroyed. Now, listen to verse 4. For we who are in the tent groan, being burdened, not because we desire to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up in life. Now, let's break that down. He says, right now I'm in a tent. One day I'm going to get a resurrected body. He calls that a building. But in the meantime, he says, I'm going to be unclothed. That's interesting language, isn't it? Right now, my soul has a body. He calls it a tent. One day, my soul's going to get a resurrected body. He calls it a building. But there's going to be a period of time when my soul or my spirit doesn't have a body. He calls that being unclothed. Now, when is that going to happen? That's going to take us to the next step on the journey here. The second part of this chart is the Hadean realm. The second part of this chart is what we call Hades. Now, people oftentimes get confused about this because when they think of Hades, they think that Hades refers to hell. They think Hades is the place of punishment. Brethren, that is not right. The word Hades actually refers to the dwelling place of the dead. Hades is kind of a holding area for disembodied spirits. Good people who die go to Hades. Bad people who die go to Hades. I think part of the reason we're confused about this is because the King James Version takes two different Greek words, Hades, Hades, and the word for Gehenna, which is hell, and it translates both of these words as Hades. It's two different words. It translates both of them with the English word hell, and that is incorrect, and it has caused a lot of confusion. For example, in Matthew 16:18, Jesus promised, upon this rock I will build my church, and the King James says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. In the original language, it's not Gehenna, it's not hell, it's the word Hades. He says, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. You know what that means? Hades is the dwelling place of the dead. Jesus, for 3 years, had been telling his disciples, the kingdom is coming. I'm going to build my kingdom. I'm going to establish my kingdom. In Matthew 16:18, he says to them, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades. In other words, the realm of the dead is not going to prevent this. You know what Jesus was saying? He'd been telling his disciples for 3 years, I'm going to establish my kingdom, and what he's saying is, the fact that I'm going to die and go into the realm of the dead, that's not going to stop my kingdom. Why would that be important? They might have thought when he died, well, he's not going to establish a kingdom. He's dead now. He told them in advance. That is not what's going to happen. But you see, the word being changed confuses us. Now, if you don't understand the distinction in these two words, you're going to be very confused. Now, incidentally, in the Old Testament, it's written in Hebrew, mainly. The New Testament's written in Greek, mainly. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for Hades is Sheol. S-H-E-O-L. It's the realm of the dead. In the New Testament, the word is Hades. Hades is the realm of the dead. It's the same place. Sheol and Hades are the same place. Once you understand that all people go to Hades when they die, it will clear up some things for you. For example, in Acts 2:31, the King James Version refers to Jesus after he died as going to hell. Friends, Jesus did not go to hell when he died. The word there is Hades. Jesus went to Hades when he died. That is an incorrect translation in the King James. If you remember in Luke 23:43, Jesus told the thief on the cross, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. When you understand that paradise is in Hades, then Luke 23:43 and Acts 2:31 make perfect sense together. Now, in Hades, there is a place where the righteous go to await judgment, and there is a place where the wicked go to await judgment. The best description I know in all of the Bible of Hades is in Luke chapter 16. It describes both compartments. Now, I want to go there and read that. Luke 16, beginning in verse 19. I'm going to read it, and then we'll make some observations here. Luke 16:19, there says, there was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. That means he was living it up. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores. Every day they would just lay him at the outside of his house, at his gate. He's covered in sores, desiring to be fed with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. He just wanted his garbage. He just wanted his leftovers. And it came to pass that the beggar died. Now listen. And was carried by angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell, the King James says hell, it's the word Hades. And in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. That is, he died, he went to Hades, specifically the section known as torment. And he seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried, and he said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And besides all of this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, so that they who would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us who would come from thence. Now let's make some observations. First, I want to talk about the place where Lazarus was taken. This is at the top of the chart. This is paradise. We are told Lazarus died, and he was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. I have oftentimes heard it said when they do interviews with people and they ask them, what thing do you fear most in this world? The thing that people oftentimes say, number one is death. Number two is usually public speaking or spiders or something like that. Number one is death. People fear death the most. Could that be the reason that when a righteous person dies, the Lord has angels awaiting to escort us and to say, fear not? When a righteous person dies, he will open his eyes to see angels. I believe a year ago that when Sherry's dad, who was a faithful gospel preacher for many years, when he breathed his last breath and he settled down just beyond our ability to see, his soul departed his body and angels escorted him to paradise. It's the same place Jesus told the thief, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. In fact, the etymology, if you study the origin of the word paradise, it carries with it the idea of a pleasure garden. Now, look at the bottom of the chart here. The second area of this place called Hades is where the rich man went. It says the rich man also died and was buried, and in hell, the word is Hades, he lifted up his eyes. Notice there are no angels. He doesn't get an escort of angels. He lifts up his eyes, being in torment. This is the place that the Bible calls Tartarus in the original language. This place is described in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4 when it says, For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down into chains of darkness. Now listen, it has the word, cast them down to Tartarus. What is this? It is the place in Hades where people who are wicked go. He cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto the judgment day. This place is described thus. Verse 22 says, the rich man also died and was buried. Verse 23, listen to this. And in hell, in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. Sometimes when I preach about this, I spend some time talking about the suffering in this place. In fact, I've got a whole sermon just on that. Very briefly, would you observe with me the misery that's in this place? If you die and you go to hell, would you observe that this rich man is burning in fire? Would you observe that he is crying, he's begging for mercy? He believes that a mere drop of water on the tip of his tongue would bring him some relief. And would you appreciate with me that every person from the beginning of the world until now who has died lost in the eyes of God is there? Some of them have been there for thousands of years, like the rich man. Some of them have been there for months. Some of them have been there for moments. Now, another observation that I want you to appreciate with me is that there is consciousness in the Hadean realm. There is a doctrine that is taught by some in the religious world. The Jehovah's Witnesses teach this. It's called soul sleeping. Soul sleeping teaches that when you die, you're asleep. You don't know anything, and you just remain asleep until the day of judgment when the Lord wakes you up. I want to tell you that this passage, as well as many others, teach us that is not the way it's going to be. The rich man is crying in pain. Lazarus is comforted. Psalm 116 and verse 15 says, Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Brethren, I don't believe we're being told it's precious to God when I become unconscious. One time I was preaching in Middle Tennessee, and I preached a sermon kind of like this one, and afterwards a brother walked out, and he said, Don, that was a great sermon. He said, but you're wrong about something. He said, you're wrong about there being consciousness in Hades. And he handed me a little folded up piece of paper, and he walked off. Well, man, I couldn't wait to open that thing. So I opened it, and it said, Ecclesiastes 9:5, the dead know not anything. Incidentally, that's the same way the Jehovah's Witnesses use that verse. And so he was saying, when you die, you don't know anything. But I want to suggest to you, he was using that verse out of context. If you will read the context of Ecclesiastes chapter 9, that was Ecclesiastes 9:5. If you read the next verse, Ecclesiastes 9:6, you will see the phrase, under the sun. Ecclesiastes 9:3, under the sun. 9:9, under the sun. 9:13, under the sun. Over and over and over in that chapter, you're going to see the phrase, under the sun. Now, what's that talking about? Things going on under the sun is not in Hades, it's back on the earth. That's where the sun is. What he's telling us is when you die and you leave this world, the realm that is under the sun, you don't know what's going on back under the sun anymore. You know, there is a popular doctrine that people have, and I guess it's comforting. I see why people like it, and it's the idea that when a loved one dies and they go into the realm of the dead, that they're watching us. There was a song a few years ago, I really liked it. Steve Wariner sung it. It's an old country song now from the 80s, I guess. And it was called There are Holes in the Floor of Heaven. And the idea, y'all remember, I see a few old people remember that song. And he's, in the song, the man's lost his wife, and it turns out he's got to raise his daughter alone, and the day comes that she gets married, and he says it's raining, and it's tears from heaven, and there's holes in the floor. The idea is she's watching from heaven, and she's watching over us. Brethren, the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible says the dead know not anything under the sun. And that makes sense. Could you imagine being in paradise and seeing all the terrible things happening in this world? I can't wrap my mind around that. Now somebody says, now Don, I disagree with you about that. I think you're wrong about this part. I can prove this. 2 Chronicles chapter 34, King Josiah is told by God that he's going to bring punishment upon Jerusalem. God says, I'm going to punish Jerusalem for their sins, but he says, Josiah, you're going to be dead before it happens. So 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 28, he says, surely I will gather you unto your fathers. You shall be gathered to your grave in peace. That is, you're going to die. Now listen, therefore your eyes shall not see all the calamity that I shall bring upon this place. What does that mean? You're going to be dead, so you're not going to see what goes on back under the sun. The dead know not anything under the sun. One final thing I want to notice about the realm of the dead. I want you to notice on the chart here, there's a green line between paradise and torment. I've got it labeled here as a great fixed gulf. The reason for that is Luke chapter 16 says there's a great gulf, there's a chasm, there's a divide, so that a person can't pass from one side to the other. That means that if you die and you go to paradise, you are there to stay. If you die and you go to torment, you are there to stay. That means that every person who has died lost in the eyes of God, they are still there. You know, the religious world has given us all sorts of explanations what happens to you when you die. You know, if you talk to some, what happens when you die, some people say, well, you get reincarnated. And they will say, you know, if you've lived a good life, you'll come back as a human being. If you lived a really good life, you'll come back as a rich, good-looking human being. And if you lived a bad life, you might come back as an animal, you know. Some people have the idea, don't swat that fly, it might be Uncle Ricky, you know, that sort of thing. And then, but the Bible doesn't teach that. Some people have the idea that when you die, the Roman Catholics teach us that when you die, you can go to a place called purgatory. Purgatory is a place of punishment that you go to and you suffer for a while until you've paid your debt. Then you can come out and you can go to a place of reward. You know what? This passage teaches us it doesn't work that way. There is a great gulf fixed. When you go to the place of suffering, you don't transfer from one side to the other. Luke 16 tells us the doctrine of purgatory is a false doctrine. I want you to ponder that with me. That means that every person who has died lost in the eyes of God and goes to a place of torment, they are still there. Some of them have been there for thousands of years. And I think about them crying, I'm tormented in this flame thousands of years. Now that brings us to the next point on the chart, and this is the resurrection day. We typically call this the judgment day. The Bible usually calls it the day of the Lord. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10 says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. What's going to happen on that day to the souls that are in Hades? In Hades, we've got paradise, we've got torment. When the judgment day comes, what's going to happen to the people in Hades? Now listen to me. On the day of judgment, Hades is going to give up its souls. It's going to be emptied of souls. This earth is going to give up its bodies. The souls and the bodies are going to be reunited. Now hold on, I know what you're thinking. Listen what the Bible says. John chapter 5 and verse 28 says, Jesus said, the hour is coming in which all that are in the graves, that's the Greek word for tombs, they shall hear His voice, and they shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. The soul and the spirit, they're going to be reunited, but listen to me. It's going to be a different body. It's not going to be this body. It's not going to be this flesh and blood body that we have now. The resurrected body is going to be, it's going to be different particles, if you will, for lack of a better term. It's going to be a different, I don't know a good word for it. It's going to be a different material, if you would. Numerous times over the years, I've had people come to me and they've said, Brother Don, is it going to be, in fact, I remember an old lady in the church came to me one time and she said, Brother Don, is it a sin to be cremated? And I said, no, sister, it's not a sin to be cremated. Why would it be? And she said, just seems like it's going to be a problem on the day of judgment. And I said, sister, it's not going to be a problem on the day of judgment. The Lord made us from the dust of the ground. It is not going to be a problem because, you see, this physical body is not what's going to inherit the kingdom of heaven anyway. How do I know that? 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 50 says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. I want you to listen. The Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about the resurrected body, but it tells us a few things. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 44 says, the body, that is the physical body, is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. Now let's break that down very quickly. First, he says the resurrected body will be incorruptible. Brethren, the body we have right now is subject to death. It is weak. It is frail. It gets old. It's going to die. The resurrected body is not going to be like that. He says the resurrected body is going to be a glorious body. You know, if we would be honest, there are many things associated with our current bodies that are not glorious. They are lowly and they are vile. That won't be so with the resurrected body. The resurrected body will be raised in power. This body gets weak. This body has to have sleep. It wears out. It is frail. Resurrected body won't be like that. He says it's going to be a spiritual body. So on the day of resurrection, I'm going to have my new resurrected body, and I'm going to have my soul, and they're going to be reunited, and then I will be in a building, a house from God, not made with hands. You know, I look forward to that in a way I never did before, because when I get my resurrected body, I'll be able to walk again. It won't be this broken, corruptible body that we have now. So the day of judgment is going to come. Somebody has said to me, you know, I don't understand. In fact, before we get to that, we look here at the chart about what's going to happen to the people in Hades on the resurrection. What if the Lord came tonight? What would happen to us? What would happen to us if the Lord came tonight? The Bible answers that also. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 52 says this, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, listen, the dead shall be raised incorruptible. That's the people in the realm of the dead in Hades. Listen to the last part. And we shall be changed. You know what that means? Those of us who are still living, he says, we are in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, we're going to be changed, and we will get that new resurrected body, and then we're all going to stand before the judgment bar of God. That takes us to the last step. This is the second to last step. This is the judgment. after both the good and the bad have their resurrected bodies, we're all going to stand before the judgment throne of Jesus Christ. Matthew 25:32 says, all nations shall be gathered before him. He shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. Ladies and gentlemen, all of humanity is going to be there. On that day, the rich man and Lazarus will stand before the Lord to receive their eternal judgment. On that day, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will stand before the Lord to receive their eternal judgment. On that day, Ahab, Jezebel, and Judas will stand before the Lord to receive their eternal judgment. Romans 14 and verse 12 says, so then every one of us, listen, every one of us shall give an account of himself to God. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10 says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that which he has done, whether it be good or evil. Sometimes people say, I don't understand the point of the judgment anyway. If a person's already been in Hades, or he's already been in torment, or he's already been in paradise, it seems like he's kind of already been judged. If he's already been in Hades, he knows he's lost. If he's already been in torment, seems like he knows he's lost. If he's already been in paradise, seems like he knows he's saved. I think we sometimes have a misconception about this, because we think of the judgment day like it's a day when God's going to weigh the facts and say, oh, okay, he gets to go to heaven. Oh, he's got a lot of bad things, he's going to go to hell. It's not going to be like that. We would probably more accurately call it the pronouncement of Judgment Day. It is the day, in fact, the moment you die, the Lord knows where you're going to go. But you see, on that day, the Lord's going to state the reasons why you're saved, or he's going to state the reasons why you are lost. It is the pronouncement of Judgment Day. Now, somebody says, you know, it still seems kind of unnecessary, because the righteous and the wicked already know where they're going to spend their eternities. Friends, I want to tell you the Judgment Day is important for several reasons. Number one, it is important for those of us who are still living. We haven't been in torment. We haven't been in paradise, so it's important for us. Number two, the judgment is important so that righteousness may be displayed. He said, what in the world are you talking about? I want you to think about this. The last time that the world saw Jesus Christ, he was dying on the cross, condemned as a criminal. Now you say, no, remember he was seen by lots of people. He was seen by 500 at one time. Those were all his followers. The last time his followers saw him, the last time the world saw him, he was condemned as a criminal. But friends, on the judgment day, every eye shall see him as the righteous judge. And it's important for that reason. Thirdly, the judgment day is important because it is a day of exposure. Listen to what I'm about to say. I don't believe there will be a single person in hell who doesn't know why he is there. There won't be a person likewise in heaven who doesn't know why he is there, because on the day of judgment, the Lord will state the reasons why. We will have the pronouncement of judgment, and we will know the reasons. And so the day of judgment is also very important. The Lord will be exalted. The reasons why will be stated. Now that's going to take us to the very final step on this chart, and this is eternity. Matthew 25:46, the Lord says, these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Now the word eternal and everlasting in English are two different words. In the Greek, it's the exact same word. Why is that important? Because, friends, it says the length of heaven and the length of hell are exactly the same length of time. There is a doctrine that is taught by some today that teaches that when you go to hell, you're just burned up and you just cease to exist. That's not what the Bible teaches. How long is hell going to last? Revelation 14 and verse 11 says, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they shall have no rest, day or night. Now you can see on the chart there are two options for where a person will spend eternity. At the top is heaven. Have we lost it? What happened? Did I go to the last one? All right. Oops. How did that happen? All right. We see two options for where we will spend eternity. At the top is heaven. We see it. It is the place that is in the light. Heaven is the place that the Lord has in mind in Matthew 25:46 when He speaks of life eternal. He says, "Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." At the bottom of the chart, you see the place that's called hell. You can see the fire and the brimstone. This is the place that the Lord has in mind in Revelation 21:8 when He describes it as the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. It's the place He has in mind in Matthew 25 when He says, "These shall go away into everlasting punishment." Friends, I'm going to tell you something. I cannot think of anything that is more terrifying than that. A person who dies and goes to hell has tomorrow and the next day and the next year and the next 100 years and the next million years to suffer and to burn, and he never gets any closer to the end. When I think about lifting up my eyes and being in hell and knowing that I'm going to suffer forever and ever and ever and there is nothing that's going to change it, it makes me think, I don't care what I have to do. I don't care what I have to say. I don't care what I have to give up. I don't want to go to that place. The soul enters the body at the point of conception. For the next 70, 80, 90 years, that soul stays in the body. The body wears out. For that 80 years, we love God with our soul or we don't. We worship God with our soul or we don't. The day comes that the body dies, the spirit returns into the hands of God. It goes into the realm of the dead. On the day of judgment, we stand before the Lord, and we will receive eternity in heaven or eternity in hell. I want to tell you a true story, and I'm going to offer the Lord's invitation. About 5 years ago, I moved from Charleston, South Carolina, to the Memphis, Tennessee area where I am now, South Haven, Mississippi. We're just below the line in Memphis. Before I moved from Charleston, we had a man in the congregation that had been unfaithful for months. In fact, he and his wife, his whole family had been unfaithful. On a particular Sunday night, I got through preaching and I walked into the foyer and I saw the man sitting there in the foyer and he had his face in his hands. He just looked distraught. And I thought, he's going to get his life right tonight. I talked with him for a minute. He didn't get his life right. He left that evening. The next morning, he got up to go to work. Maybe it's the day after. But he got up to go to work, and it was raining on this particular day. He was riding a motorcycle. He was not wearing a helmet. I don't know what happened. Some people have said that maybe a car hit the back wheel of his motorcycle, and he lost control, and he spun out, and his head just smashed onto the pavement. They say that they called a helicopter to come and medevac him to the Medical University of South Carolina. They called his wife, they called the elders of the church, and they came to meet him. When his wife got to the hospital, they didn't even know if he could hear. They didn't know what the situation was with his brain. His wife knew that they had been unfaithful. She didn't know what to do. And so she stood next to her husband, and she said to him, "I'm going to say a prayer." And she said, "I'm going to ask for forgiveness for you. And if you agree," she said, "I want you to squeeze my hand." Why did she do that? She didn't know what else to do. She was desperate. She knew they were Christians, and she knew a Christian can pray for forgiveness. And so she said this prayer, and then she said, "I think he squeezed my hand." I don't know. The doctors don't know. Could have been a reflex. Maybe he did. I hope he was able to make his life right with the Lord. Now you might say, "Why are you telling us this?" Brethren, I'm telling you this because that man was in his 40s when that happened. I think that we all listen to sermons and we think they're preacher stories. You hear things like this. I'm going to tell you, my thinking has forever been altered because 5 months ago, I got on a four-wheeler and I'm riding on a beautiful day thinking everything was great. I have no idea what happened, and I opened up my eyes in a hospital bed and looked at the doctor and said, "What am I doing here?" No memory of the accident. What if I had lifted up my eyes in eternity? The only thing that would have mattered is, how was I living seconds prior to that? You could leave here this evening, and you could be struck by a car, and you can lift up your eyes to see angels, or you can lift up your eyes in torment and think, "I just heard a sermon about that." But it will forever be too late. Tonight, the question, where do you go when you die? The answer is, it depends on how you were when you were living. If you were faithful at the moment you die, you will lift up your eyes to see angels to carry you to paradise. If you were unfaithful, you will lift up your eyes in torment. Where do you go? Where will you go if you were to die tonight? And that's the question that I'm going to leave you with this evening. If you're not a New Testament Christian, the answer is not good. You will lift up your eyes in torment. Only those who have been washed in the blood of Jesus, that is, that are part of the Lord's church, are going to lift up their eyes in paradise. And then only those who are faithfully walking in the light will lift up their eyes in paradise. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, the Bible teaches to become one. You have to hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. If you say, I have never heard that in my life, talk to us and we'll set up a study. If you're here and you say, I know what to do, I am ready to do that tonight, we are ready to assist you. If you say, I am here as a Christian, but I haven't been walking in the light, and if I lift up my eyes tonight, I know it wouldn't be good. Make your life right tonight. We would count it an honor to go to God and to pray for you. This evening, you have an opportunity to get your life right with the Lord. Where will you go when you die? The answer is, it depends on where you are when you're living. This evening, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, won't you come as together we stand?